Hi there, this is Solitron from Solitron Films, and welcome to another random review. This is a random review of another Christopher Walken film, not that I'm biased. It's 1980's The Dogs of War, directed by John Irwin. This is the Twilight Time, Region A release. This has the international cut at 114 minutes, which is the version of the film that I've always seen, but there is actually a US cut on this disc as well, which is 104 minutes, so it's 14 minutes shorter, but I've never actually seen that version. Please let me know in the comments below if you've seen the shorter version and what the differences are. I might watch it one day, but obviously I'm going to stick to the 118 minute version because that's the one I'm used to. This is a film based on a Fredrick Forsyth book about mercenaries. Christopher Walken stars as a mercenary who's hired by somebody shady to go to a fictional African country called Zangaro. It was actually shot in Belize, to see if a coup d'etat was possible, and while he's under the guise of a bird photographer, there's a great scene where he recites Latin names of birds to an army official, which is just wonderful. He gets captured and beaten up and then kicked out of the country, and the shady government guy comes back to him and pretty much asks, can you put together a team to essentially have a coup so the shady government can put in their own man. But as most Western controlled coup d'etats have been, either in Africa or the Middle East or Central America, it's usually about money. So even though the dictator that's there is crazy, the person that the shady government wants to put in charge is just as bad, just for different reasons. So as an actioner goes, it's fairly straightforward. It's directed fairly nuts and bolts by John Irwin. It's actually photographed by Jack Cardiff, who obviously did lots of amazing work with the Archers. And it's a fairly standard action film. But for me, what sets it apart is the non-action stuff. Christopher Walken gives another just fantastic performance as essentially a shell of a human being. When he's in the kind of normal life, not in the jungle or not being a soldier, you can tell that he's just out of step with everybody else. He keeps a gun in his fridge. He keeps a gun pretty much in every table in the house in his apartment. He's always on edge. Of course, Walken, one of the great eyes actor, his eyes are like flicking everywhere during this film, to see constant threats. His team is made up of Tom Berenger, who just loves the action, and Ed O'Neill from Married with Children. he's actually one of his crew, even though he turns down the chance to go to Africa for this mission. And Tom Berenger thinks it's just because his heart's not in it anymore. When Christopher Walken is in Africa the first time, he bumps into Colin Blakely, who's a journalist, who gives a great turn, and is also a young Jim Broadbent, as Colin Blakely's cameraman or soundman. Can't actually remember, despite the fact I've just watched the film. It's a very brief performance by Jim Broadbent, but he delivers it with gusto. I mean, obviously for me, if Christopher Walken wasn't in it, I probably wouldn't have it, I probably wouldn't like it as much. But the reason it elevates above kind of standard fare is because of Christopher Walken. In the action scenes at the end, after events have transpired, his eyes are almost bulging out of his face. It's just that, exhilaration and the rush of adrenaline, but then also the emptiness of that's the mission over. At times he looks almost like a wild animal. And then obviously it turns out that the person that they want to replace the despot with is just going to be as bad for different reasons. It's just going to open the country up and is being exploited by the shady government, whoever that is, even though the West has a long history of screwing over small countries just to get their natural resources. It's a lovely little film. It's not a great film. It's interesting, as in it's similar to the best kind of bank robbery films, as in it does focus on the nuts and bolts of how to arrange all your weaponry and the logistics of actually arranging a coup d'etat, because it follows Walken and his team about as they're trying to get prices on guns and ammunition and things like that. So that's a kind of interesting kind of side to it. You kind of see the nuts and bolts of organising a covert military operation. Obviously it's similar to McBain, which Christopher Walken also did, but McBain isn't nearly as good as The Dogs of War. It's obviously a bit similar to Delta Force and The Wild Geese, but as far as I'm concerned, it's better than those films. The Wild Geese is a bit campy, with Roger Moore famously choking a drug dealer with lots of white powder. So this isn't a great film, it's not a masterpiece, but if you like Christopher Walken, it's a must-have and a must-see. Again, when he's out in the world, the real world, he's just completely disconnected. Before he goes out to Africa, he meets up with his ex-wife, JoBeth Williams, and he tells her that he's going to move to Colorado and get a proper job, but she kind of sees through that, and ourselves as an audience kind of get the fact that he's never actually going to settle down. There's only really one way you can end up. There's also a really good scene when he goes to his usual doctor after he comes back from Africa the first time, after he's been beaten senseless, and he goes through a list of all his injuries, So you really get this picture of a man who, for some reason, goes through all this pain and suffering to get paid to participate in other people's wars and other people's fights for money, essentially. And it really is one of the best portrayals of that, because really, action-wise, there's not a huge amount of action in the film. It's like I said, it's 118 minutes for the international cut, but there's maybe only about 20 minutes of actual action in it. It's much more a kind of character piece. You could argue that the other members of his crew don't really get fleshed out that much. You kind of just get the impression they're in it for the juice. Obviously there's a money element, but especially Tom Berenger's character, you do get the feeling he's more into just the adrenaline of fighting and firing big guns. Yeah, so this is from 1980, which sadly is almost 40 years ago. So if you haven't seen it, I would definitely check it out. Again, this is a Twilight Time Blu-ray. It's not really available on Blu-ray, but you can pick it up on DVD, probably for under £5. It is kind of a film that's either forgotten about or just kind of glazed over, because again, on the surface, it is just kind of a Fredrick Forsyth, wham bam, thank you ma'am, mercenary picture. But I do think Christopher Walken just elevates it with just another great Christopher Walken performance. Again, I've said it before, I'm biased, but when Christopher Walken eventually dies at some point, people will actually look back on his work and say he was actually a great actor. He wasn't just a person who played nutters and psychopaths. He actually gave really good performances, and there's nobody else like him, which, as far as actors are concerned, that's pretty hard to say about most people. So if you want a bit of Friday night fun, then you can't go wrong with The Dogs of War, even though it is a bit of a downer. Yeah, because in the end, we all know how politics end up and how shady governments act. So these guys are essentially just pawns in that whole process. But every now and again, they can get one over on the shady government characters. If only real life was like that. So thank you very much for watching. Please leave your comments below, whether you've seen The Dogs of War, what you think of it, and what's your favourite mercenary team put together for a mission. And hopefully we'll see you again. So this is the Solitary Ronin saying thank you very much for watching, and have a good weekend.